Imagine waking up inside a structure that has not touched land in 4 months, that carries no connection to the internet, no access to a bank, no ability to call for external help, and no realistic prospect of emergency resupply. And inside this structure, right now, 5,000 people are going to work. They are cooking meals, repairing engines, treating injuries, managing waste, producing electricity, purifying water, and maintaining psychological coherence inside a steel hull moving through open ocean. And every single one of those functions must operate without the infrastructure the modern world depends on to survive. A city of 5,000 people built on land has access to regional power grids, municipal water treatment, interstate supply chains, a federal emergency services, satellite broadband, and the entire interconnected nervous system of modern civilization. Strip all of that away. Remove every external dependency. Now take that city, compress it into 1,092 feet of steel, give it a nuclear reactor instead of a utility company, give it desalination plants instead of a reservoir, give it a 6,000 calorie per day food operation instead of a grocery distribution network, give it a medical facility instead of a hospital referral system, and then ask the question the title demands: at what point does an aircraft carrier stop being a warship and start being something closer to an independent, engineered civilization? Because the deeper you go into the systems that keep that hull functioning, the more the answer reveals itself, not as a metaphor, but as a literal engineering reality. And the systems that make it real are far more complex, far more interdependent, and far more psychologically demanding than anything built on land. The first system most people overlook when they think about an aircraft carrier is not the flight deck, not the weapons, not the aircraft. It is water. Fresh water is the invisible constraint around which every other system on the ship is quietly organized, because without fresh water, nothing else functions. A modern Nimitz-class or Gerald R. Ford-class carrier produces somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 gallons of fresh water every single day using distillation plants that pull seawater from the ocean, heat it, separate the salt through evaporation and condensation, and return potable water to the ship's internal distribution network. This is not a backup system. This is the primary system. There is no municipal supply line running beneath the hull. There is no reservoir being tapped. Every shower, every meal, every medical sterilization procedure, every cooling loop in the engineering plant, every hydraulic system topped off with fluid, every fire suppression test, every laundry cycle for the uniforms of 5,000 people, all of it originates from seawater that the ship converts itself continuously using energy drawn from the same nuclear plant that powers everything else aboard. If you lived here and the distillation plant degraded by 30%, you would feel it within hours. Shower schedules would compress. Cooking water would be rationed. Medical procedures requiring sterile water would require prioritization decisions. And if the plant failed entirely, the carrier would not simply become uncomfortable. It would begin losing operational capacity in cascading sequence, because water is not one system on this ship. It is the hidden substrate beneath every other system, and its failure does not announce itself loudly, but instead quietly dismantles everything downstream. This is where civilian logic begins to collapse, because on land, water infrastructure failure is someone else's problem. You call the utility, you wait, a crew arrives with tools and access to a regional grid. Here, the crew is the utility. The tools are already aboard, and there is no regional grid. Every failure is internal. Every solution is internal. Every consequence is internal. And this logic, the logic of total self-containment, is the design philosophy that governs not just water, but every system aboard. Food operates under the same closed constraint. Feeding 5,000 people 3 meals a day in a facility with no grocery delivery, no restaurant supply chain, no walk-in produce warehouse replenished weekly, means that every meal served in the carrier's multiple galleys is the product of a provisioning calculation made weeks or months in advance, loaded aboard during port visits in quantities that require careful structural planning because food weight affects trim, and managed through a supply chain that exists entirely within the ship's own hull. The carrier carries enough food to sustain the crew for extended deployments, typically measured in weeks of full provisioning, and the logistics of that storage, rotation, caloric calculation, and preparation involve a food service operation that in scale and complexity rivals a mid-sized hospital or university dining system, except that it operates with no resupply expectation, no external quality check, and no ability to run short and reorder by Tuesday. If you were working a 12-hour maintenance shift on this ship and the food service chain encountered a major equipment failure, a primary refrigeration system losing thermal integrity, for example, you are not looking at a vendor calling for emergency repair. You are looking at an internal engineering team diagnosing the failure while the food safety clock runs, decisions being made about what inventory can be preserved, what must be consumed immediately, what must be disposed of, and how 5,000 caloric schedules get restructured around that loss. The pressure is not dramatic, it is logistical and continuous, and it sits underneath daily life like a low-frequency hum that everyone aboard understands even when they do not articulate it. But this is where the carrier's design philosophy becomes most visible. Because these systems are not designed to be perfect. They are designed to be redundant, repairable, and internally solvable. Because the ocean does not care about your equipment failure, and the mission does not pause for your supply chain problem. Power is the system that makes all of this possible. And on a nuclear-powered carrier, the power generation architecture is so far removed from anything a modern city experiences that it requires a complete reframing of what electrical infrastructure means. A Nimitz-class carrier is powered by two Westinghouse A-4W nuclear reactors, each one generating approximately 550 megawatts of thermal energy, which is converted into propulsion and electrical power sufficient to drive a 100,000-ton vessel at speeds exceeding 30 knots, while simultaneously powering the ship's entire internal electrical grid, lighting, computing, weapon systems, medical equipment, water production, food preparation, air conditioning, communications, aircraft launch systems, and the hundreds of smaller electrical loads that aggregate across a population of 5,000 people. For reference, the average American city of 5,000 people draws somewhere between 15 and 25 megawatts of electrical power under normal consumption. The carrier's reactors produce power at a scale that makes the comparison not just impressive, but structurally different in kind. The city on land is dependent. The city at sea is generative. And here's what most people never consider. The reactor does not simply replace the power company, it eliminates the concept of a power company entirely, because the fuel cycle of a naval nuclear reactor is measured not in days or months, but in decades. A properly fueled nuclear carrier can operate for 20 years without refueling, which means the ship's power independence is not a temporary operational advantage. It is a designed-in permanent condition. The carrier does not need fuel deliveries to keep the lights on. It does not need a grid connection to maintain water production. It does not need external electrical infrastructure to run its medical facility or its communications array or its catapult systems. It carries its own star, contained in a pressure vessel, managed by a crew trained to a standard of technical precision that has no civilian equivalent, and it will keep burning for 2 decades regardless of what happens to the world above the waterline. But nuclear power introduces a constraint that is simultaneously the ship's greatest strength and its most demanding management problem, because the safety architecture required to operate a nuclear plant inside a vessel that might be subjected to combat damage, severe weather, mechanical failure, and the psychological strain of long-duration isolation is a system unto itself, a system built on discipline, redundancy, procedure adherence, and zero-tolerance monitoring that runs continuously, around the clock, with no shift that is ever considered low stakes. If the reactor's cooling system experienced an anomaly, not a failure, just an anomaly requiring investigation, the response protocol activates immediately, watchstanders go to heightened readiness, engineering logs are scrutinized, backup systems are verified, and the carrier's command structure receives real-time updates because inside a steel hull surrounded by ocean with 5,000 people aboard, A nuclear event that escalates is not a problem that gets handed to a regulatory agency and managed over weeks. It is an internal emergency with a compressed timeline and no external support. The consequence architecture of nuclear failure at sea has no civilian parallel, and this is why the training pipeline for nuclear-qualified sailors is among the most technically demanding in any military service anywhere in the world, and why the cultural emphasis on procedural discipline aboard nuclear carriers is not bureaucratic formality, but load-bearing infrastructure. Remove the discipline and the procedures don't hold. Remove the procedures and the reactor's margin of safety compresses. Compress the margin long enough, and you have created a condition that no amount of bravery or improvisation can resolve. And this is where the psychological dimension of carrier life becomes a systems issue rather than a human interest story, because 5,000 people living in close quarters, working rotating shifts, operating under the awareness that isolation is total and failure is internal, require a social and organizational architecture that is as deliberately engineered as the water plant or the reactor. The carrier's command structure, its schedule discipline, its rank hierarchy, its recreational systems, its communication allowances, its behavioral health resources, these are not amenities, they are system components. Psychological cohesion is a functional requirement of carrier operations, not a quality of life bonus, because a crew that fractures under isolation strain stops being a crew and starts being a population management problem inside a hull that cannot afford population management problems. Sleep is a system on this ship. Berthing compartments on a carrier are organized with the engineering logic of space optimization. Racks stacked 3 high, personal space measured in cubic feet, privacy achieved through curtains rather than walls, because the alternative to high-density berthing is fewer crew, and fewer crew means fewer people available to sustain the systems that keep the ship alive. If you lived here, your relationship to personal space would be redefined not gradually but immediately, and the psychological adaptation required to normalize that environment, to stop waiting for it to feel temporary and start treating it as the baseline condition of your daily existence, is a process that the Navy manages through training, through schedule structure, through the social architecture of shared purpose, and through the simple operational reality that when your shift starts, the system needs you, and personal discomfort is not a valid input into that equation. Medical infrastructure on the carrier follows the same closed-loop design philosophy that governs every other system, and it represents one of the most striking examples of how the ship's engineering philosophy forces capability inward. A carrier's medical department is staffed with physicians, surgeons, dentists, nurses, and corpsmen equipped with operating rooms, intensive care capability, dental operatories, pharmacy, laboratory, radiology, and psychiatric support, not because the Navy wants to replicate a hospital at sea, but because the alternative to that capability is medical evacuation, and medical evacuation from a carrier operating in denied or contested waters, or simply from a carrier that is 6 days from the nearest port, is not always possible and is never preferred. The medical department's existence is not a statement about priorities, it is a statement about geography. When you are operating 3,000 miles from the nearest trauma center with 5,000 people aboard, the medical system you carry is the only medical system available, and its capability ceiling is the capability ceiling of your entire medical response capacity. A surgical case that would be routine in a land-based hospital, appendectomy, orthopedic repair, acute abdominal emergency, must be handled aboard, by the staff aboard, with the equipment aboard, because there is no transfer option that fits the timeline, and there is no referral network accessible from international waters. And this constraint shapes not just the medical facility's equipment list, but its training philosophy, its staffing logic, its pharmaceutical inventory, and its relationship to the rest of the ship's command structure, because medical readiness is operational readiness, and operational readiness is the only currency that matters in the environment the carrier was built to operate within. The waste management and environmental systems of the carrier complete the closed-loop picture in ways that are rarely discussed but functionally essential, because a floating city of 5,000 people produces waste at a scale that, if managed incorrectly, would compromise both the ship's habitability and its legal compliance with international maritime law. The carrier processes human waste, food waste, hazardous materials, aviation fluids, nuclear-related waste streams, and general refuse through a system of onboard treatment, compaction, incineration, and controlled storage that is as carefully engineered as the water production system, because the output of 5,000 people living in close quarters does not simply disappear, and the ocean is not a disposal solution the Navy is permitted to use without constraint. This system operates continuously, invisibly, under the awareness of almost no one aboard except the people whose job it is to manage it, and its failure would be felt immediately in the habitability of a closed environment where there is no opening a window and no calling a sanitation department. What the carrier represents, when you stand back far enough to see the full architecture, the power generation, the water production, the food logistics, with the waste management, the medical capability, the psychological structure, the command hierarchy, the communication systems, the maintenance cycles, the supply chain compressed into a hull, is not a warship with city-like features. It is a city with warship-like features. And the distinction matters because a city's primary design obligation is to sustain human life within its boundaries. And that is precisely what the carrier is engineered to do, without external support, for months at a time, in environments where external support is unavailable by design. The engineering philosophy that produced it is not a military philosophy first, it is a survival philosophy first, a self-reliance philosophy, a systems-thinking philosophy that begins with the question of what 5,000 people need to remain alive and functional, and answers that question entirely from within the hull. Every system described here exists because isolation makes external dependency a liability, and every system is designed to be repairable, redundant, and internally solvable because the ocean does not negotiate with equipment failures, and the mission does not pause for infrastructure gaps. There is one system aboard, however, that this analysis has not fully examined: the communication and information architecture that allows the carrier to maintain operational awareness, receive and transmit orders, and manage the information environment of a crew living inside a communications blackout where personal internet access is restricted. Outside contact is monitored and limited, and the flow of information is itself a controlled resource. How that system is managed, how information deprivation affects operational cohesion over months, and how the carrier maintains command authority across a network that must be simultaneously secure, resilient, and survivable in a contested electromagnetic environment. That is a question the hull has an answer to, and it is one worth understanding entirely on its own terms.